The single most important issue on the minds of most Democrats is not COVID, it's voting rights. With the midterm elections just 6 months away, Democrats are putting increasing pressure on the White House and Congress to pass voting rights legislation. Will it work? And will we see new federal voting rights bills in 2022? Experts weigh in. Coming up next.
From Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Republican lawmakers in 43 states have introduced a total of 253 bills aimed at restricting access to the ballot box for tens of millions of people. Republican-controlled states, including southern states that employed lynch law terror laws to block African Americans from voting during the decades-long period of Jim Crow segregation and flooding their legislatures with measures to effectively disenfranchise working class, poor, and minority voters. The laws focus on tightening voter ID requirements, purging voter rolls, and restricting absentee and mail-in ballots. Activists say Democrats are not doing enough to fight for voting rights and are essentially being punked by Republicans in the Senate who are holding up two critical voting rights bills. What does this mean for the midterm elections and beyond? Here for our leadoff discussion is Clifton Albright. He is co-founder and executive director of Black Voters Matter. Good morning, Clifton. I think you got to turn your audio on, Cliff.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. Happy New Year to you and welcome back. I feel like you and I talked a lot last year when, these critical elections were, I guess it was 2020, when these critical elections were happening and we were, trying to mobilize or wondering if we could mobilize the base to elect Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and then obviously the big election in Georgia of Senator Warnock. And here we are again, and this time worried that, are we going to be able to mobilize the base? But this time the fight feels bigger to me. How are you thinking about where we are in terms of voting rights at this moment?
Yeah, obviously we're at a critical juncture, right? And many people have said it. The president has said it himself. This is the biggest attack on voting rights since the Civil War. We know that there's been a slow motion coup taking place. Tomorrow's the anniversary of January 6th, but more importantly, there's been an ongoing coup taking place ever since January 6th in terms of all these states, 19 states that have passed some form of voter suppression bills, 33 different bills. And that's just the start. Like we're about to roll into, it's January, so we're about to roll into new sessions of state legislatures in many of these states that are going to try to pile on to what they were already doing last year. So this is a critical moment that we're at. And as you mentioned, there's two pieces of legislation that can deal with a lot of these issues, but they've got to finish the job and get it done. And that's going to take changing the filibuster in the Senate. It's going to take the president leaning into it. It's going to take immediate action because, we're really past the time where this is getting to a point where it's going to impact these midterm elections.
So I know you and Natasha Brown, you're co-founder of Black Voters Matter, registered millions of voters. I mean, you guys were probably one of, a few voting rights organizing groups that were really visible over the last couple of years, not just working on voting, registering voters for the federal elections, but going into states in the South and getting city council members and mayors and other local elected officials elected, because we know, politics are local, and although we focus so much on the president, it's so important who is in those state houses because this backlash, these restrictive voting laws are coming, from state legislatures who have, been packed with Republican lawmakers. But you and your Natasha wrote an op-ed that I read recently in The Guardian, kind of scathing, I should say, where you call out President Biden for not taking this issue of voting rights matter seriously enough. And I don't know if it's that seriously enough, but using his political capital, I guess is what you said, to focus on infrastructure and build back better, but not on voting rights. Are activists fed up with Biden and feel like, it's time to, it or get off the pot? Is that kind of the thinking in the activist community?
Yeah, very much so. And as we've pointed out in the op-ed as well as in other places, you look at the things, we're not even asking him to do things that he doesn't know how to do, right? He's done this. He's done this even as recently on infrastructure. He went to Congress twice. He took the walk or the drive from the White House to the Capitol and went to Congress twice to make the case for infrastructure, to tell them, look, y'all need to pass this. Y'all need to pass it now. Don't worry about Build Back Better. We'll get it done, but I need you to pass this right now. He's not done that for voting rights. He's not come out and said, he's moved from saying that ending the filibuster or modifying the filibuster would cause chaos. And he's now moved to saying that I'm open to modifying the filibuster. But guess what? History isn't made off of presidents telling us what they're open to. It's made off of them telling us what it is that they want, what it is that they're willing to leverage and use the political capital for. He has not done that, right? He has not leaned in and said, hey, Senate, I want you to modify this filibuster. I want you to modify it today. It's not that hard to be that explicit, but he has failed to do so. We know that he's not in the Senate, but doggone it, he was in the Senate for like 40 years. Yeah. And then as vice president, he was technically president of the Senate. So he's got over 40 years of Senate experience. You can't have all that experience and then tell me that you can't wrangle one or two votes. That's simply unacceptable.
So, Cliff, you've been in a unique position. You have been on virtual calls with the vice president who has been tasked with voting rights. That's in her portfolio of things the president has given her authority over. But I know I read something where you said he gave her the job, but didn't give her the tools that she needed to be effective in the job. Tell us what some of those conversations were like that you've had with the vice president around, voting rights.
Yeah, and it's not even so much about those specific conversations, but it's about looking at what are the things that are actually in her portfolio that she's actually had authority over. And you know the deal, Areva, right? We've all been in situations, or we know of people that have been in situations where you got a job and you've got a responsibility, but you don't have the authority to do the things that you need to do to get it done, right? You've been in a position where you got to make a project happen, an event happen, but you don't have control over the budget. That's not authority, right? That's just responsibility without the authority to actually get something done. And so in her portfolio, she does not have authority over the filibuster. She does not have authority. She has authority over, doing things with the executive level actions to make it easier for people to get registered and for meeting with groups and all of that. But at the end of the day, only Joe Biden can speak for the White House about the filibuster, and he has not done so. So this isn't about the vice president. She's doing some good things in terms of what she has the authority to do, but only he has the authority, along with Chuck Schumer, to deal with this filibuster issue. That's what we want to see, especially over the next couple of weeks. It's unacceptable that we are a year out from this insurrection, and yet a year later, 11, 12 months after we gave them power in the White House and in the Congress, that they have not been able to do something on this. So we're calling out the president. We're also calling out Chuck Schumer. Rest in peace, Harry Reid just passed away, and people have been pointing out, some of the tactics. Some people call him gangster, right? Some of the tactics that Harry Reid used to do. I'm convinced that if Harry Reid was Senate Majority Leader, we'd have this voting rights legislation right now. So we're calling out Chuck Schumer as well, Senate Majority Leader. He's Senate Majority Leader because Black folks came out in Georgia and made history and shocked the country.
No, absolutely. And, you are a supporter of the vice president. I'm an ardent supporter. I'm a long-term friend. And so this isn't about her as much. But I do wonder, do you know what those conversations must be like? Or you have any insight into the conversation she, in her historic role, is having with the president around this issue? Since you said he's the only one that can make a difference, she has his ear in ways that no one else does. So do you have any insight into what those conversations are?
Yeah, honestly, I can't say that I've got any insights around, what conversations they've been having. I think the only insights I can give is that, going off of what she has said publicly, that she's just as frustrated and wants to see voting rights legislation as much as any of the rest of us. And so I'm hoping that has translated into communicating around the need to modify the filibuster. We know that he's got some folks around him that have been in support, but we also know that there's some folks in that White House that are not supportive of this filibuster reform, that in fact aren't really convinced that we even need the voting rights legislation, right? That they've leaked all these comments about, oh, well, people can just out-organize the voter suppression. And, oh, if we just pass enough good legislation like infrastructure, then, we'll get enough voters that, it won't even matter that all these states have passed all these attacks on voting rights, which is actually very insulting in addition to just being bad strategy.
Well, that's where I was going next. Biden ran on a platform of obviously making equity, a big part of everything that he did. So you can't think of any more, critical issue around equity than voting rights because, Black folks in particular being disenfranchised by some of these restrictive laws. What do you think is holding him back? Now, you just said there are folks in the White House, vice president excluded, but others who are not on board with, doing everything necessary to get the voting rights legislation passed. How large and how, vocal has that contingency been in the White House?
Yeah, I think it's been very vocal. I think that's a big part of the reason why we're at the place we're at now, where he hasn't leaned in yet. But it's not just a function of the staff that he has and the advisors that he has around him, right? Because he picked those folks for a reason, right? Ultimately, President Biden himself has a certain nostalgia for the way that things used to be, right? This was part of some of our concerns, even during the primaries, where we pointed out that, Joe Biden often talks about, compromise. And if we could just go back to the way things were before Trump, as if we didn't have some of these problems before Trump, right? So he's always had a nostalgia, and a nostalgia for the Senate traditions, right? Which again is part of the reason why he's resistant to modifying the filibuster. So there's this part of his personality, of his political experience and background that makes him say, well, it's simply not that bad of a thing where we need to go as far as modifying or ending the filibuster. That was a concern for many of us, even going back a couple of years ago during the primary. So part of it is about who's around Biden, but part of it is that the president has around him advisors that reflect his own nostalgia for the way things used to be, and really a fundamental lack of understanding of what it is that we're up against. Some people really, even though we talk about January 6th, some people haven't fully accepted that a coup was attempted in this country because there's these notions of American exceptionalism, like, ooh, that could never really happen. Like, yeah, it was bad. Yeah, they beat up police officers, all that stuff, but it wasn't really a coup. It wasn't really insurrection. So that keeps you, when you can't identify the source of the problem, it keeps you from coming up with the proper solutions. That's part of the issue that we think we're facing with President Biden.
Are you at all encouraged, Cliff, by Schumer? Schumer now, at least we're hearing a commitment to move away from infrastructure and Build Back Better, which has stalled itself in the Senate, and to move towards voting rights. And now Schumer saying that he's going to hold a vote on or before January 17th, which we know this year is MLK Day. How encouraged are you by that announcement by Senator Schumer?
I'm a little encouraged, right? I was encouraged a little bit before the end of the year when they first started the shift towards saying, okay, we'll put Build Back Better on hold because we think we have a better option with voting rights, and because it's honestly more critical at this point. We need them both, but right now, every second that we lose on voting rights is a second that they're about to lose this democracy. So I'm a little encouraged by that, but still very cautious, because even the other night on Joy Reid's show, he basically admitted that he doesn't have any extra evidence to suggest that Manchin, or Sinema for that matter, is necessarily going to go along with the filibuster reform plans. And so I'm encouraged that he's going to put something out for a vote and force them to either vote for or vote against voting rights, force them to either show that they're on the side of democracy, or they're on the side of Jim Crow and voter suppression and insurrections. So I'm a little encouraged by that, but I'm a little cautious because it's not yet clear that he's actually done what needs to be done in order to get Manchin and Sinema and some other folks, because there's some others that are a little hesitant as well that have been kind of, hiding behind Manchin. But it's not clear that he's actually got the vote. And so we're going to keep on putting the pressure on. We're going to keep on making phone calls and sending text messages and doing civil disobedience. And as you mentioned with the King holiday, the focus of this holiday, with the permission of the family, is really about not just community service, that's important, but but Dr. King was about advocacy, and Dr. King was about justice. And in this moment, this holiday needs to be about the fight for voting rights.
Yeah, Derek Johnson, NAACP president, he said he said he's tired, I guess, of the pronouncements and the press releases about the meetings. And I'm curious, have you been in any of those meetings? I know Derek has been in some of those meetings with Joe Manchin. Have your organization been in any of the meetings with Manchin or Sinema?
No, not our organization per se. Like some of our partner groups have been in meetings with both of them. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, a group of real courageous students out in Arizona who were on a hunger strike, along with Joe Madison. Shout out to Joe Madison, who is still on his hunger strike. But these groups, these students out in Arizona met with Sinema, and so we've been kind of privy to some of these discussions. But at the end of the day, we've been causing so much heck and doing so much civil disobedience and getting arrested outside the Senate that Joe Manchin isn't necessarily calling us up for any of those meetings.
Yeah, so you saw the dust up, I'll call it, between VP Harris and when she went on that interview with Charlamagne the God, and Charlamagne asked her if who's the real president here. She of course pushed back as she should have in terms of making very, very clear to Joe Biden. But it does feel like Joe Manchin has this oversized amount of power. And one question is, how do you deal with someone like that? Some of the activists, like you guys have been, like you said, the civil disobedience and really going hard at him in the pieces that you've been writing, in the op-ed pieces as well. Others are fearful that if you push too hard, he could walk across the aisle and become a Republican and join forces with Mitch McConnell. What do you think from all the work you've done around this? What's the best way to deal with someone like him who seems to be holding way too many cards?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like any other situation where you've got somebody, you're at a negotiation table, and you've got to use. Sometimes you got to use the carrot, sometimes you got to use the stick. All right. At the end of the day, Lyndon B. Johnson, who, to be clear, only passed the Voting Rights Act because our movement forced him to. Right. So with that said, though, he was famous for getting in your face and spitting and all that stuff and twisting arms in order to get done what he wanted to get done, including the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But part of that also means sometimes using the carrot, right? So in the midst of, I mean, look, why were they able to get some of these votes that they were able to get on infrastructure? Because at the end of the day, there's a bunch of senators that want some bridges and some roads, in their state, including the ones that voted against it, but they're still bragging about it, right? Everybody's got something that they want. And so with Joe Manchin, and we know the deal.
What does Joe want? Based on your partner groups that have been in these meetings, what is it that Joe and Kristen want?
I think it's a combination of things. I think some of it is very simply a matter of ego and personality. He enjoys being in the spotlight the way that he's been for the past year since he's been at this 50th vote kind of threshold. So I think part of it is that he wants this important. I think part of it is that, I mean, we got to be real. In the midst of all this, and every time that he fights against ending the filibuster or fights against Build Back Better, his donations actually go up from these corporations that want him to hold the line against, tax breaks and things of that nature for Build Back Better. And so part of it is simply that, right? That there's some fundraising attached to all this. And then part of it might be that, he's got some legislative priorities that he wants for his state. But if that was really the case, then the best thing he could do would be to support the 70 to 80% of his state that supports voting rights, the 70 to 80% of his state, his constituents that support Build Back Better, that support infrastructure. That support a child tax credit. So he's not doing his state any good by holding the positions that he's had. So it's not always very clear, but we know that there's some level of self-gain, whether that's in notoriety, attention, fundraising, resources for a state, a building or a bridge named after him. But the challenge, again, as president and as Senate Majority Leader, is you got to know what that is, right? I may not know what it is for Joe Manchin, but President Biden and Chuck Schumer need to know what it is, what that pressure point is, what that carrot is that can be offered to get him to do right. Because obviously just the ethics of it, just the history of defending democracy and defending voting rights, that's not cutting it for Joe Manchin, but something will.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, it's not your job as the activist to know that, but the folks that work with him day in and day out definitely should know that and should be able to pull those levers. I want to ask you about Georgia before I let you go. Obviously, Senator Warnock is making, some significant plays. He's been vocal on this voting rights, has called out the hypocrisy in the way the Senate has recently voted in raising the national debt ceiling to prevent a default on government obligations.
Yeah.
So said there is when there is a will to change the rules and to get legislation passed, obviously the Senate does that. And if it's around these financial issues, they've been able to do that, but obviously not around the suppression of black voters. So Senator Warnock has an election himself coming up, right? And then we have obviously Stacey Abrams, who's running again for governor in Georgia. What's happening in Georgia? Are we going to see Senator Warnock go back to the Senate? And are we going to get the first African American female governor in the history of this country? It sounds crazy even saying that, but yes, that's where we are. But is that likely to happen this year?
It's very likely happening. Let me tell you what I know. I know that we have the votes to make it happen, right? The challenge, though, is going to be, especially given the Georgia voter suppression bill, which on top of all the things that have been talked about, the criminalizing giving out food and water and making it harder to vote by mail and all of those things, we can't forget that it's got this provision that makes it easier, not just easier, makes it possible for the Republican legislature to replace boards of elections. In fact, they've already started doing that. And so that's the thing. We can go out and do everything that we need to do, right? We can knock on every door and get every vote that's out there and have massive turnout, and we can have the numbers to win the election. But at the end of the day, Georgia, the Secretary of State in Georgia and the Republican legislature with this law can now literally do exactly what Trump wanted them to do. Trump said, what? Go out and find me some votes, right? Or get rid of some votes. They could actually, with this law, they can overturn votes in a county, say Fulton County, where most black folks live, right? And say, you know what, this was fraudulent. We don't want to count those votes. The same thing they tried to do in Michigan, right? In Detroit, in Wayne County, where of all the places, they picked not even the whole county, but they picked just the Detroit boxes in Wayne County to try to throw out those votes. That's possible. Like, this is not hyperbole. So at the end of the day, no matter what it is that we do, what we're saying is we have got to have this federal legislation. There is no way for us to out-organize this. As popular as Stacey Abrams may be, and as popular as Senator Warnock may be, and I believe that the speech that he gave a couple of weeks ago where he called out to hypocrisy over the filibuster, that needs to be required watching in all of our schools, right? But regardless of what they do and what we do as organizers, we have got to have these federal protections, or else it's simply not going to be enough.
So just devil's advocate, last question for you, Cliff. Assuming it doesn't happen, because we know politics and we know race. We haven't even talked about how, the racist part of this whole filibuster piece, which is there. We're going to talk with my next guest about, but assuming we don't get it, so we don't get the legislation across the finish line, where do we go?
I mean, we're gonna continue to organize in our communities and work hard to get people out for this election for their own interest, right? For the interest of the Black communities where we organize folks. But we're not gonna be out there trumpeting, like there's this saying, vote blue no matter who, right? We're not gonna be out there trumpeting that. Like, one of the things we've been saying is we're gonna work just as hard to turn folks out as they work to pass this legislation. Right. I don't even want to
mean not encouraging Black voters to vote the Dem ticket if we don't get this legislation. Because I think I read somewhere where activists are saying, don't count on the base, Democrats, if you don't get this law across the finish line, these federal pieces of legislation across the finish line, Black voters may turn their backs on you. Do you see that happening?
And that's true. And that's not wishful thinking on my part. We're just telling them the real deal of what we're seeing and hearing and feeling in the streets. Folks are not going to be motivated if they don't get this legislation, passed. We've never told people just vote a straight ticket, right? We always go out and we talk to our folks about our issues. And so even during the Senate runoffs, we weren't just talking about vote Democratic or trumpeting, Ossoff and Warnock. What we were talking about is voting rights. What we were talking about was COVID relief. What we were talking about is the George Floyd Act. That's a whole nother issue that again, a year later, we've still not seen action on. But we were talking about the issues that were important to our community, and based on that, then engaging folks about why it's important that they come out. And so, yes, to your question, we will continue to talk about our communities and our issues and try to get folks motivated up and down the ticket. But we will not just go out there just randomly telling people, oh, you need to do this for a particular party. If that party, you can't say that we need to give you power and then when we give you the power, you don't use it, and then ask us to go back out, asking us to give you more power, right? And so we're going to continue to do what we do. But again, we can only be as effective as they are effective at using the power that we gave them to pass this legislation.
Okay, that's pretty depressing, Cliff.
But here's the good news. Let me end it on the good news.
Give me some good news, because I'm sitting here thinking, okay, Black folks don't turn out and vote, we're gonna be just like, oh my God, we're gonna be in trouble.
We're
gonna do it happen. We've seen it happen, right? So we know it's a possibility. So
right,
go ahead, give me the good news.
This is the good news, right? We have the power to force them to pass this legislation. As I said, President Johnson did not want to pass the Voting Rights Act in '65 when he was asked. He didn't think it was the right time. Our movement made him act on that, right? And it's the same thing that's going to happen now. We're going to get this legislation. This is the good news. We are going to get this legislation. We're going to get it not because I believe so much in the president, not because I believe in Chuck Schumer, certainly not because I believe in Joe Manchin, but we are going to get it because our movement has always made that happen. We make things happen. We make things possible when other people try to tell us that it's impossible. So we are going to get the legislation. And then when we get the legislation, we're going to mobilize our voters. And then we're going to deal with these issues for the long term. That's the good news.
All right, Cliff. You brought me off that cliff. No pun intended. All right. That is great news. And I believe that because I know we're resilient people. So tell us no and then watch us. So thank you so much, Cliff. We will be watching. We got, work cut out for us, but what would Black folks do if we didn't have hard work to do? So we know we're going to get it done. And with folks like you leading the charge, I'm even more encouraged. Always a pleasure to sit down and talk with you. Keep this pressure on because yes, we need this legislation. And yes, we need Black voters to vote in record numbers because we need Stacey in office. We need Reverend Warnock back in the Senate. And we definitely need a Democratic administration. It ain't perfect, but man, it's so much better. So, I can't even imagine going back to where we were. But again, thanks so much, Cliff. All right, next guest. We're talking about voting rights legislation. Can't really talk about voting rights without understanding both the policy and what the Constitution says about folks' rights to vote. So joining me now is Professor Margalynne Armstrong. She's a constitutional law professor at Santa Clara Law School, and she's a returning guest to the special report. Always good to see her. And joining her is Michael Sozon. He is a senior fellow at American Progress, where he focuses on democracy and government reform. Good morning, Michael. Good morning, Professor Armstrong.
Good morning, Reva.
Morning.
You both heard Cliff. Cliff ended on a very positive, upbeat note, saying we're going to get this legislation passed. I'll just ask both of you. Start with you, Mike. How hopeful are you that we're going to get one, if not both of those bills that are pending, these federal pieces of voting rights legislation? How hopeful are you we're going to get it passed this year?
I share Cliff's optimism. I know it's still going to be an uphill fight, but I know that the discussions are very intense right now in the Senate, and the White House is involved. And the senators are hearing from grassroots activists and regular Americans, the type of people that Cliff and so many other people help lead and work with. So the pressure is on. Joe Manchin is in the middle of all the discussions. Kyrsten Sinema, Senator of Arizona, is involved as well. They are seen as the two holdouts, obviously, still. And Senator Schumer had a really powerful press conference yesterday with a number of other senators where he laid out the plan. He's going to force a vote on filibuster reform by the Martin Luther King holiday. So that's less than 2 weeks from now. So it's as intense as it ever has been. And Senator Manchin continues to say he's open to some sort of reform. He's talking to his colleagues. And, he kind of says one thing one day, another thing the next day. He has a habit of doing that. But right now, he's still very involved. And because of that, I'm optimistic, and I'll also just throw in he spent months working on the Freedom to Vote Act. He helped to rewrite it. He helped to try to get Republican support unsuccessfully, but he's really bought into it. His name is on the Freedom to Vote Act. That gives me also a little bit of hope that he's not going to just let us all down.
Yeah, you're right. He definitely says one thing one day, the next the other day. Because I just saw him yesterday in the halls on a reporter caught him in the hallways of the Senate, and he says, "No, I don't think we should change the filibuster." I was like, okay, whatever. But quickly, Mike, help us understand the difference between the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Act, because those are the two pieces of legislation that are stalled. What's the difference?
Sure. The basic difference is that the Freedom to Vote Act will help set national baseline standards so that no matter where you live, no matter which zip code you're in, you're going to be guaranteed basic rights around your right to vote, and that the elections aren't going to be sabotaged, subverted. And it also has provisions that would prevent partisan gerrymandering. I'll also throw in there, it also has great provisions that would reduce the harmful effects of big dark money that corrupt our system. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would be an update of the seminal 1965 Voting Rights Act, which, as you know, was so critically important to making sure that African Americans, minorities can vote, and it needs to be updated. And the big difference between these bills, as Senator Warnock has described it, is the Freedom to Vote Act will help with the emergency that's been going on. That's going on over the past year or two. Will help retroactively fix these terrible state laws that have been enacted. And the voting rights bill, the John Lewis bill, would look forward to future changes that states were trying to make that would have to be pre-cleared by the government. Both of these bills have to be passed.
And Professor Armstrong, Mike raises the issue about the gutting of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. We know it was Section 5, right? That was actually gutted, which was the pre-clearance section, which meant that states that wanted to make changes to their voting rights legislation had to get clearance, pre-clearance from the Department of Justice to make sure any changes wouldn't disadvantage minority and other marginalized populations. I was reading an article that said, the gutting of the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act happened on Obama's watch, right?
Well, it happened due to a Supreme Court decision, Shelby County versus Holder. So Holder was the Attorney General during the Obama administration, but this was the Supreme Court decision that said that the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act were essentially outdated and based on the civil rights era situation. And of course, the court doesn't really look at the fact that the Voting Rights Act has been very instrumental in not slipping back to the situation that existed before it was enacted through this pre-clearance. And so we really have the Supreme Court to look to for the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, because once they removed the pre-clearance, the states that had previously had to submit their laws to the Department of Justice no longer had to. And you've had all of these crazy laws in the last 8 years that have been specifically designed to limit the vote of Democrats who are associated with people of color in these states. So we're really looking to something that Obama didn't have, or his administration didn't have anything to do with. It was the Supreme Court.
Right. No, absolutely. The Supreme Court gutted in that case. You just referenced that Shelby v. Holder case. But Mike, there is some criticism of Obama, his White House, and congressional Democrats during the Obama years. There's some critique that they didn't take serious the effort to reverse. They didn't make efforts to reverse the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act. They didn't make efforts to try to enact new legislation in the years after Shelby. Is that, appropriate critique?
There has been a little bit of that criticism, as you note. But I think in general, the Obama administration and the DOJ did a lot of big, heavy lifting to try to make our nation a more just place, including on the issue of free and fair elections and voting rights. And I think what people would probably note also is that it was hard to envision for some that we would enter the Trump era and that the Republicans would so uniformly follow Donald Trump over a cliff in opposition to protecting free and fair elections, right? Or that the Supreme Court would continue to gut the Voting Rights Act the way it did just several months ago again. And so now we see that Republicans are almost uniformly opposed to even the reauthorization of the important Voting Rights Act. I think you all will remember, and your listeners will probably remember, that in years past, in decades past, it's always been a bipartisan way that the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized. In fact, the last time it was 98-0 in the Senate, and George W. Bush signed it into law. Now we're at a point where the Republicans filibustered in the Senate, even the beginning debate on reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. I will give a shout out to one Republican senator, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, who at least bucked her party and agreed to at least start debate. But otherwise, this has sadly turned into an incredibly partisan issue, this issue of voting rights that didn't used to be like this in recent history. And I think a lot of people obviously trace this to Donald Trump. And he's flat out said for years that if everybody can vote and if voting is made widely, easily available, that Republicans will start losing elections.
Well, it's not just Trump. Republicans have done this for years. I mean, they got the state houses on this whole theory that they could not win an election if it was really based on the popular vote. And the Republican power in the states, having the governors and the House, has really propelled a lot of this legislation that's coming through the states. I mean, that's why we have to have a national act, because when left to their own rights, the states are in Republican hands often, and they're going to try to suppress the vote because that's the only way they can win.
But doesn't this go back, Professor Armstrong, all the way to 2000, the presidential election, where we saw the Supreme Court in that 5-4 decision basically stop the counting of votes in Florida, basically handed the White House to George Bush, who had lost the popular vote and probably who would have lost the Florida vote, had the recount proceeded. So, did we take heed? I'm a Democrat through and through, but I feel like we've got to be critical. We got to put criticism where it needs to be placed. And I don't know if the Democrats have done enough and are doing enough now to address this whole voting rights issue. So even before Donald Trump, I mean, the Republicans stole the election from us in 2000. Did we respond appropriately even back then?
I don't think that the Democrats had given up on the idea of democracy as thoroughly as the Republicans had. You've heard so much about how the Democrats haven't struck back in the ways that the Republicans have, in terms of just having this kind of a scorched ground approach. I mean, the fact that you don't have a single Republican supporting the Voting Rights Act, out of the tradition where, as you said, 98 out of all of the senators have voted for voting rights before. There's been this kind of sea change that's been very aggressive and very destructive of democratic principles in order to win on the part of the Republicans, that the Democrats just haven't stepped up to that level of, I think, cynicism and just the play for power that's gone on. So we haven't played as dirty. I say we, the Democrats haven't played as dirty as the Republicans have. And you see it everywhere. Again, going to the Supreme Court, the fact that Gorsuch is on the court and not Merrick Garland.
Right.
That was totally dirty Republican tricks by not bringing the vote up to the Senate in terms of the confirmation. So, how low do the Democrats have to sink? Well, Michelle Obama would say they go low, we go high. How long can
I don't know if
happen?
Michelle would say that today, Professor Armstrong. She said that back then. I've been following Michelle pretty closely on social. I think she's got a new mantra. I think it's a little different. But I do want to ask you, Mike, about this. This filibuster, I think, gets a lot of folks confused. It's presented as if it's this ironclad rule that has never been broken. But we know there are like 150, 160 exceptions to the filibuster, and there are all kinds of carve-outs. So why is the notion of a carve-out for voting rights, become this big, like life-changing thing when there are already so many exceptions to this filibuster rule?
Exactly. And that's become the most perplexing and aggravating exercise here, because as you said, there have been literally over 100 different exceptions made throughout the years to the filibuster. Filibuster itself has been tweaked many times in terms of the threshold needed. It's not anywhere written in Constitution, in stone, anywhere. This is a Senate rule that senators have changed many times, including in recent years around judges and nominees. So it's in recent history it's been changed. And so it is frustrating that a mere Senate rule is taking precedence over saving our democracy, right? I mean, we've got at least 17 states that have jammed through, frankly, racist voter suppression and election subversion laws on party line votes, Republicans doing it themselves over the objections of Democrats in at least 17 states. And when it gets to the US Senate, there's suddenly this cry for bipartisanship and the need to preserve the filibuster rule in the name of saving the Senate. Well, it's just, many of us feel that an arcane Senate rule, the Jim Crow filibuster, is not more important than saving our democracy. We are optimistic and hopeful that Joe Manchin is going to see that as well, that he sees that he has a place in history right now to actually save our democracy. The light is shining bright on him. We need him to do the right thing. We're trying to push, we're trying to pull. We know he can only be pushed so far before it might be too far, but we really are in the moment where people have got to understand that the Senate filibuster cannot reign supreme here while our country's democracy is going down the tubes.
Boy, we got to leave it there. Thank you so much, Mike, for joining me. Thank you, Professor Armstrong. Always a pleasure to see you. Always appreciate your insights on such critical issues. We're definitely going to be watching. We're going to see what happens with this vote that's going to come up by MLK Day. See if Schumer, has the chops to get this done. Cliff said that if Harry Reid were in the hot seat, that he thinks it would get done. So maybe that's a challenge to Schumer to live up to the standard of Harry Reid. But again, thanks both of you for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My next guest is Richard Greene. He's a communication strategist and civic educator. I want to talk with Richard because I'm wondering if there is a messaging problem. Good morning, Richard, and thanks for joining us. I think you got to turn your audio, Richard. There you go. Thank you. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you.
I wanted to talk with you about this conversation around voting rights because I read that one of the experts, voting rights experts, con law professor here at UC Irvine, says, look, this is a 5-alarm fire. So he's a pundit, he's an expert, he's in the bubble, I'll call it. But I talk to everyday people every day, and I don't get the impression that that message of 5-alarm fire, that our democracy is at stake, that everything we fought for in this country is on the line. That message is not trickling down to the street level. So do we have a messaging problem around voting rights in this country, you think?
I think we have a messaging problem around a lot of things. I think people do not pay attention to what's going on in politics. They don't really understand how Donald Trump tried to, and in fact, in large part, destroyed our democracy, how Mitch McConnell has been doing that for years and years and years, how Mitch McConnell changed the filibuster rules to put 60% of the votes needed to completely eradicate anything that we care about on the Supreme Court with the 3 Trump appointees. And I do think that what was mentioned earlier, this sense that America is this great shining beacon, American exceptionalism, nothing like that could ever happen here, that people are blinded, just like when people thought, oh, OJ is such an incredible guy, he could never have killed anyone. And it took a while for people to get with the program and realize that OJ very well may have done some very bad things. So I think that we've got a long road ahead. And I think the major focus needs to be on the 50 Republican senators who are not supporting what every Republican senator supported before, which is voting rights. And we have to put the pressure on them because 20 of them are up for reelection. And we need for them to finally pay a price and have a consequence for standing up against every single thing that America really wants.
Well, and speaking of those 50 Republican senators, are we placing too much emphasis on these two Democrats, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema? Like Cliff Albright said, maybe, this focus has given them so much, ego power, gratification power, star power, that we really should, take the spotlight off of them and focus on some of these other more moderate Republicans to get the job done. Would that be a better strategy?
In a perfect world, that would be an awesome strategy. However, Mitch McConnell is a monster. He is a Machiavellian genius. He is not going to allow any one of his other 49 Republicans, with the possible exception of Lisa Murkowski, to vote for anything that the Democrats want. So we are stuck with Manchin and Sinema. But the good news, Areva, is on November 8th of this year, we get to elect two more or more than two more real Democratic senators who are going to vote to transform the filibuster, or at least create carve-outs so that we can get these things done, including voting rights. Will we make it until that happens? Maybe, maybe not, but it's certainly a huge motivation to get out and replace Sinema and Manchin by electing two really good Democrats, and even more, who will make Joe Manchin, and he'll be very upset about this, irrelevant, and make Kirsten Sinema irrelevant as well. And
are you talking about replacing them in these November elections, or are you talking about two other state elections?
No, we can't replace them because unfortunately they're both not up for re-election until 2024.
What states are you talking about?
Well, we can pick up a seat in Pennsylvania. My friend Tim Ryan in Ohio can flip Ohio. We've got North Carolina, that's a possibility. And, there are a number of others that are on the table, and we have to hold our own. But it's really possible. If people understood, I wrote an article, and the article in Medium, put Medium, Richard Greene, and the question is, what does the Republican Party stand for? They stand for nothing that the average American wants, including all of the things in Build Back Better and, of course, voting rights. And if the American people understood that, and the 120 million Americans who are not otherwise going to vote actually got out and voted, we could absolutely destroy the Republicans in the House and the Senate, and we can get everything we wanted accomplished, including flipping a bunch of governor seats so that if these Republican legislatures pass these horrible voting rights laws, a Democratic governor can, in fact, protect the integrity of the elections in that state.
So Richard, you said the average America doesn't care about politics, but this is so much bigger than politics. I mean, this is everything that people do care about, even if it doesn't, present itself in that way to them. So how do we get that message? We hear Cliff saying, look, if we don't get these bills across the finish line, he cannot guarantee Democrats up and down the ticket that Black voters are going to be motivated enough to come out in the huge numbers that we saw in 2020, because they're going to say, look, we did what you asked us to do. We gave power to the Democrats, and we didn't get a return on our investment. So what is the messaging, your communication strategist? What should we be doing at this moment? Because we don't have a lot of time left on the clock. These elections are happening very quickly.
I understand. You're not going to like my answer. It's a little bit of tough love. The truth is, we needed to elect 270 people who supported voting rights, who supported the incredible parts of Build Back Better, who support climate action, who support police reform. We needed to elect 270, 218 in the House and 50 in the Senate and 1 in the White House. We elected the 218 in the House, but we only have 48 who were really willing to do what's necessary to make those things happen in the Senate. And we did elect a president who's ready, willing, and able with his pen to sign it. So we just need 2 more people. And for the people to blame Joe Biden for not twisting Joe Manchin's arm or Kirsten Sinema's arm, there are limits to what a president can do. I'm sure he is trying every single thing he can. Now, does he need, like Lyndon Johnson, to literally spit in their face? I think Joe Manchin's got a huge ego. I think he does believe that what he's doing is the right thing. And I think he is compromised. And Kristen Sinema, I don't think is actually all there from a mental health standpoint. That woman scares me more than Joe Manchin. But the point is, we didn't elect enough Democratic
So you're
senators.
saying the message doesn't matter, it's the math. You're saying no matter what the message is, it comes down to simple math. We've got to get those 2 extra senators voted in, and that won't happen, as you said, till November 8th, into the Senate. And I get you, I hear you, and I'm an economics major, so I understand math really well, so I hear what you're saying. But help us in the meantime, because we got a long way to go from January to November. We got some midterms coming up in June. What is the most effective message, if there is one, that can kind of cut through this stalemate? Because right now, 50% of the country, and as you're sitting there saying Republicans stand for nothing, I'm thinking of all of my Republican friends who will tell me that they stand for, protecting the lives of fetuses. They stand for, liberty and not forcing people to get vaccines. They'll rattle off a whole laundry list of things that they do stand for, all of which I think are ridiculous, but that's what they believe. So as long as they believe that, what is there any message that can break through, can create any kind of sense of that the Democratic message is being heard? Because we know the Republican message, Fox News, most watched cable news station in the country, we know their message is resonating with their voters. Ours seems to be muddled.
Right. So 2 things. One, for the activists, the Black Lives Matter activists and people who work so hard to have us flip Georgia and win the White House, as Cliff was saying before, who are looking forward to not voting to punish Joe Biden. I think we have to actually, as I said, have a little tough love messaging with them and say, listen, you worked your asses off, but we weren't quite there. We needed 2 more, right? Don't blame Joe Biden. Don't blame Chuck Schumer. I met with Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer wants this as much as you and I do, and as much as every Black activist does. He cannot force 2 of his members of his caucus to vote a certain way. He can try everything possible, but he can't force them. But here's the messaging. The messaging is, if you care about police reform, if you care about climate action, if you care about lowering prescription drugs and affordable insulin, if you care about pre-K education, if you care about childcare, if you care about equal rights for women, or equal pay for women, if you care about all of the things that have already passed the House of Representatives only by Democrats, then you have to get to the polls and you have to elect more Democrats to keep the House and to expand our majority in the Senate. Because unless you do that, you can whine all you want, but if you wake up on November 9th and Kevin McCarthy is going to be the Speaker of the House, or Donald Trump, who is legally able to be Speaker of the House, is going to be the Speaker of the House, and or Mitch McConnell is once again the majority leader of the Senate, we might as well all go home for the next 2 years, because nothing is going to get done. And to your point, yes, the Republicans stand for something, but there is not one thing, Areva, not one thing that Republicans stand for and are fighting for and have introduced legislation for that is supported by the majority of the American people. Not one thing.
Richard, you just gave the most pragmatic appeal and synopsis of what Democrats should be saying to each other. And I'm sitting here, I'm a pragmatist myself, thinking you're 100% right. We're angry, we're emotional. So the emotional side of us says, look, we gave you the power, you didn't get done what you said you'd get done, and we're pissed off. We've got to feel that emotion and allow ourselves to go through that grieving process. Then we've got to come to your message, which is one of pragmatism, which is one of, we didn't get it all the first time around. Let's not lose ground. We've got to stay the course. We've got to do a little more. We got to work a little harder. We got to find more votes so we can get the votes we need next time around. Because if we don't, we set the clock all the way back to zero. And it may take decades, not years, decades to gain where we are today.
if
Great
we
message.
even have a if we even have a democracy at that point. We are this close to fascism, really dictionary definition fascism. And to your point, I don't know if you saw the movie Don't Look Up, and there's a great scene in there where Jonah Hill tells Leo DiCaprio, stop with all the math, and DiCaprio is talking about astronomy and the comet, and he goes, it's all math, right? And politics is all math. It's all about numbers. That's what a democracy is. It's a mathematical concept. And we have to play the game and get the numbers. And we have not done that as well as we could.
I think that the strategy of the activists is keep the pressure. They're going to get to the math. Cliff and those guys, they're pragmatists too. They didn't register 1 million voters and flip Georgia and get Biden in the White House without knowing the math. So they know the math. But the strategy now is keep the pressure on, and when it's time, they'll be in sync with this message, because that's what we do. We're not going to allow the Republicans to take over the country. We're just not going to sit on our thumbs and be pissed off. So I'm both encouraged by the activists and I'm encouraged by the communication strategists. So I've had a good morning. I got to say thank you, Richard. Thank you for joining us. Enjoy your trip. So glad you were willing to take a couple of moments out of your vacation to spend with us. Very enlightening message, always insightful. Keep telling us about the math. We need to hear that message as well. Appreciate it.
Happy New Year from Switzerland. Take care.
Thank you. Our first interview from Switzerland. What a treat for the new year. Thank you again, Richard. All right. Thanks to all my guests this morning. Thanks to all of you for joining me. Enlightening show. Guys, everything is on the line. We've got to stay the course, but we've also got to keep that pressure, because it's not too late. We can get those bills passed, as Cliff reminded us earlier in the show. Where there's a will, there's a way. And we need that federal legislation. We need those voting rights restored. We need folks to feel confident going to the polls that their votes are going to matter, and that their votes aren't going to just be swept under the rug or destroyed because of some local Republican elections commissioner that's been put on an elections board that now thinks they have the right to determine the outcome of an election, like we saw that Trump wanted to do with his election. So I love that we know what we have to do as activists. We've got to stay the course. But at the end of the day, as Richard said, we've got to get those 2 additional senators elected in the U.S. Senate, because then we'll have the numbers and we won't be having these battles over voting rights, George Floyd and policing law, Build Back Better, all the things that we know will make this country bigger, better, and stronger, and will help lift up kids out of poverty, help lift up middle-class families. It's within our reach. It's really within our reach. We're so incredibly close. So let's stay the course. Some words to live by before I get out. You may have to fight a battle more than once to win it. Some great wise person said that. And that's what's happening now. The whole Voting Rights Act of 1965, that was a battle. We had to fight a battle. And you heard my guest this morning talk about what that battle looked like. That was not easy, but we won that battle. And so this time around, we have to be willing to fight another battle to restore and ensure that voting rights are a right to everyone in this country. Don't grow weary. That's all those are really my words of wisdom today. Don't grow weary. We can win this battle. We can win this battle. We can do it together. I'm out. Y'all be safe out there. Wear your mask, get your booster. And remember, we are all in this together.